Why Media Group? The fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Why Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and it's great to spend this time with you. Well, we had President Trump end a 3+ month, conflict and war with Iran, and essentially escalating a situation with the Israeli Prime Minister, really speaking publicly ill about him in terms of his motives and how he's carried himself out when it comes to the ongoing conflict in Lebanon. And perhaps that had something to do with the inflation numbers in the United States because, well, it's been announced that for the month of May, inflation in the United States has risen to 4.1%. And that is the top line. But when it comes to the core CPI, it has risen to 3.4%. This is the highest since October of 2023. So essentially, the message that headline gives is that electing President Trump means that inflation will go up, cost of living will go up, unaffordability will become a crisis and will become a more serious issue than compared to when what he called Joe Biden was in office. So this is what we're looking at today. There's a lot more to cover today, but our top story is what is happening in the United States and how is it that things have gotten worse under this president? Well, now that's been announced, and with these latest numbers, is we've seen the spike with inflation and the cost of living and the cost of gas prices that affects cost of groceries and everything else in between. We've seen it here in Canada. But the Americans, they elected this president for affordability and for what he campaigned on, which is MAGA, Make America Great Again, not more expensive and worse off again. And his major platform of essentially Make America Great Again and America First. And that was the way he was going to make America great again. So now, with all this foreign interference, foreign wars, foreign things that have happened, well, a lot of Americans were asking, well, that doesn't make America first. And so now the US inflation numbers for the month of May, with the headline inflation climbing to 4.2%, very high because the Fed rate is 2%. So this is double what is the Fed rate. And the core inflation has essentially risen to 3.4%. And I'll tell you what's the difference between those numbers. But the most important thing is that this is the highest since October of 2023. So now we're in 2026 and this is really high. So now this increase has reflected essentially what we're seeing in terms of the price pressures, right, across housing, insurance, healthcare, and services in the United States. And when you have the higher gas prices, energy costs, they push the overall inflation back to the 4.2% mark. So when you add what's happened with this conflict with Iran for more than 3 months, that contributes to the 4% rate. But when you remove the high energy costs and the high food costs, then you're looking at things getting more expensive in the United States with housing, insurance, healthcare, and overall services. So now the hotter than expected data, which has now made rounds all day today, it's showing what it means for the Federal Reserve's fight against inflation, because now America has inflation, even at a higher rate than Canada. So now, after months of easing price pressures, economists that were expecting that inflation would continue to move closer to this 2% rate that is set for Feds. Instead, the latest figures are suggesting that inflation remains more persistent than anticipated as it's climbing month by month, which also means that it's going to make these near-term interest rate cuts less likely, which is what the optimism was for. If you recall, the president was asking the last Fed chair to essentially cut rates, and he would not do so. And now he's got a new Fed chair, and it does not seem likely that he's also going to cut the interest rates because inflation's high. So now the higher inflation does affect every aspect of the economy, of course. So where consumers are facing higher costs for groceries, housing, insurance, transportation, and this means that businesses continue paying more for labor and operating costs. So for financial markets, inflation directly influences the interest rates. So when you have persistent inflation, well, reducing the rates is less likely because what it means is that the likelihood of the Federal Reserve rate cuts would keep mortgages, auto loans, credit card loans, the credit card interest rate, business financing more expensive. And the reason being is that if you are to cut the rate, then inflation numbers would go up. So essentially, you would increase the interest rate to be able to bring down inflation, but that also means higher borrowing costs, right? So this can essentially slow down consumer spending in the United States and housing activity and economic growth overall. So now inflation has been the defining economic story since the pandemic. This is something that we've seen take place, and year by year, we're watching it to be able to come down. But now with this latest decisions that the president made with the conflict with Iran, well, that's changed everything for this year, not just for the Americans, it's also changed things for the Canadians in the UK, which we're seeing a resignation of the prime minister. And it affects when things become unaffordable, it affects the sitting leader, whether it's a president or a prime minister, it affects them because the way the people look at it is in a democratic society is that, hey, we voted for you to make life better, to make life more affordable, to make our lives more prosperous. And when things are getting harder and I can't buy my basic necessities and just the basic necessities of having food, shelter, water, clothing. And if those are hard to get, then it becomes a massive issue. So here you have it where we're seeing this take place in Trump's America. And perhaps this is why he signed the MOU. He signed the MOU off saying, okay, Iran, you want your frozen assets. You need 12 billion of your frozen assets. Here you go. You know what? There's another 50 billion more of your frozen assets that will be released. Do you need a reconstruction package of $300 billion? Here you go. And oh, you need us to lift the sanctions on your oil? Okay, here you go. Because what's happening at home? There's the midterm elections in November. And if the Republicans don't do well in the House or the Senate, essentially President Trump will be a sitting duck president, where he'll be in a situation where he can't really pass many laws. He can do his presidential orders signing, but again, it's going to affect him significantly. So this is massive time for the president to be able to wane things under control when it comes to what got him elected for a second term, which is affordability. Put America first, create jobs, keep gas prices low. All of those things affect it. So here you have it as what we're seeing is that these initial price increases were driven by supply chain disruptions that we saw take place, if you recall, during the pandemic. You recall the government stimulus that was put in that gave a surge in post-pandemic consumer demand. And so we've been watching interest rates go up. And then as we brought them down post-pandemic, here we have it at the situation where the Fed rate is at 2% target and America is at 4.2%. So this is obviously something we're watching. We're covering what's taking place in these Tuesday primaries. We've seen a massive turnaround when it comes to New York, where they have, been able to elect more of the socialist Democrats instead of the establishment Democrats. So a lot of things are changing in the United States, and this is what we're keeping an eye on. And when it comes to the Federal Reserve, this creates a very difficult balancing act, right? So keeping interest rates high helps contain inflation, but it also raises borrowing costs for households, businesses, and slows housing activity and creates the risk of what would be a weakened economy and economic growth. So cutting rates too early, however, could also allow inflation to accelerate again, meaning the rates would go high. So if it's at 4.2% in the United States, you don't want that to get higher. So markets will follow and focus on upcoming unemployment data, which is going to be very critical to see what that means. Consumer spending is important, and future inflation reports to be able to gauge whether The month of May represents potentially a temporary spike, or is it a start of a broader inflation rebound that we're seeing? And those results will likely determine the timing of the Federal Reserve's next move. That's what we're watching for. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.